I should have burned that damn notebook the moment I wrote the first line about him. But instead, I left it on the porch like an open confession waiting to ruin my life. It was an ordinary Thursday in October when my secret met his eyes. The air smelled of fallen leaves and rain-soaked earth, and my heart was an unruly drum under my ribs. I didn't know that the man next door, Mr. Hayes, my quiet, older neighbor who never spoke more than a polite nod, would be the one to pick it up. I didn't know he'd read it. Every word, every craving, every line that worshipped the shape of his hands. I was 22, freshly heartbroken, trying to make sense of life through poetry. He was 37, the kind of man who carried solitude like an invisible coat. For years, I'd only watched him from across the fence. Tending to his garden, feeding stray cats, sometimes sitting on his porch with a cigarette glowing like a tiny ember against the night. He was mystery made of silence, and I was a fool who mistook silence for safety. That afternoon, when I saw him standing at my door, the journal in his hand, my stomach sank to the floor. "I think you dropped this," he said quietly. His voice was low, steady, but there was something else underneath, something like hesitation, or maybe guilt. My mouth opened but no words came out. I took the journal from his hand, my fingers brushing his skin for the first time. It felt like touching static electricity, sharp, quick, unforgettable. "Thank you," I mumbled. I could feel my face burning. He nodded and turned away, but not before our eyes met. Just for a heartbeat. And in that second, I knew he'd read it all. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed every poem I'd written in that journal. The one about his hands, the way they trembled slightly when he watered his plants. The one about his eyes gray like rain before it falls. The one about wanting him quietly, like how the moon wants the sea. I buried my face in the pillow and groaned. He must think I'm insane. But when morning came, I found something unexpected on my porch. My journal, again, with a note tucked inside. "You write beautifully. Don't be ashamed of what's true. H. For Hayes." I read it over and over until the ink felt like it was carved into my pulse. Over the next few days, our paths began to cross more often than ever before. A coincidence, I told myself. But it wasn't. He'd linger by the mailbox when I came home from work. He'd offer a cup of coffee across the fence, the steam curling between us like an unspoken invitation. He never mentioned the journal again. But sometimes, I'd catch him looking at Mir Ally, looking like he was trying to find me in the spaces between words. One evening, I found him sitting on his porch steps, watching the sunset. I was walking past with my headphones in, pretending to be lost in music, when he called out, "Eli." The sound of my name in his voice made something inside me stumble. "Yeah." He gestured to the empty space beside him. "Sit with me." I hesitated, then walked over. The air smelled of pine and smoke. He handed me a mug. "Hot chocolate," he said, smiling faintly. "Didn't think you'd like coffee." I laughed. "You read me that well already?" He looked down at the mug in his hands. "I read enough to know you like things that feel safe, even when they aren't." I froze. There it was, the invisible line between us. The one I didn't know whether to step over or run from. "You weren't supposed to read it," I said quietly. "I know." His voice softened. "But I did. And I'm not sorry." Silence stretched between us, filled only by the hum of distant traffic and the rustle of wind. When he finally looked up, his eyes were softer than I'd ever seen. "You write about loneliness like it's a person you're in love with," he said. "I know what that feels like." And just like that, something cracked open. Over the weeks that followed, our connection deepened in ways neither of us could explain. He became my quiet companion in late-night talks and shared silences. I learned about his late wife, gone too soon, and how he'd built walls so high even grief couldn't climb them. He learned about the boy who broke my heart, and how poetry was the only way I knew how to stay alive. Sometimes, we'd sit together under the stars without saying a word. Other times, we'd talk until the moon faded into morning. There were glances that lingered too long, hands that brushed too close. Every moment felt like walking a tightrope over something dangerous and beautiful. One night, As rain tapped softly on the roof, I found myself reading him a new poem I'd written. My voice trembled at the edges, but I didn't stop. When I finished, he didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me with that unreadable expression of his. Then he whispered, "You make the world sound beautiful again." The next thing I knew, his hand was on mine, warm, steady, patient. And I let it stay there. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't even a confession. But it was enough to make the air between us feel alive. Of course, the world doesn't let love like ours exist without consequence. Whispers started. The neighbors noticed how often I was at his house, how our cars were parked side by side at odd hours. One afternoon, a woman from down the street gave me that look, the kind that sliced you open, and called it concern. And then came my father's voice on the phone, heavy with disapproval. "Eli, people are talking. You can't keep seeing him. Dad, it's wrong. He's almost 40. You don't know what you're getting yourself into." But I did know. I was getting into something real. Something that made the world make sense for the first time. That night, I went to Hayes's house. The porch light was off. He opened the door, his eyes weary. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "I don't care." His jaw tightened. "You should." I took a step closer. "Why are you doing this? Pretending like you don't feel the same?" He exhaled, his voice breaking. "Because I do." And then, finally, the distance between us collapsed. Our first kiss wasn't perfect. It was hesitant, trembling, almost painful in its honesty. But it felt like the first real thing I'd ever known. When we pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine. "This is going to hurt," he murmured. "I know," I said, "but maybe it's worth it." The next morning, the world felt different, like it had exhaled after holding its breath too long. I woke up to sunlight spilling through my curtains, the scent of him still on my shirt, faint like rain on paper. For a few seconds, I forgot everything else, the neighbors, the rules, the weight of judgment. There was only the memory of his lips against mine, the warmth that spread through me when he whispered my name like it meant something sacred. But reality has a cruel way of reminding you that happiness has boundaries. By noon, the whispers had turned into voices. My phone lit up with messages from an old friend. "Eli, people are saying things about you and Mr. Hayes. You should be careful." Careful. The word tasted bitter, like shame disguised as concern. When I walked to my car, I could feel eyes following me through curtains. And when I drove past his house, I saw him standing by the window, watching me go. He didn't wave. Neither did I. But our silence said what words couldn't. We were already in too deep. That night, I sat on my porch with a blank notebook, trying to write. The page stayed empty. Everything I wanted to say had already been said in that first kiss. Every fear I had was now too real to turn into poetry. Then came a knock. It was him, standing there in a gray sweatshirt, his hair slightly damp from the rain. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept either. "Can we talk?" he asked. I nodded and stepped aside. Inside, he paced for a moment before speaking. "Eli, I can't stop thinking about you." His voice cracked slightly. "But this what we're doing, it's not just about us anymore. People are watching. They're talking. And I'm not sure I can handle that again." "Again?" I asked. He hesitated, then looked at me with that haunted look I'd only glimpsed before. "When my wife died, people made up stories. They said things about meetings that weren't true. I moved here to disappear, not to be the center of another storm." I took a step closer. "You think what we have is a storm?" He sighed. "It's beautiful and terrifying." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the rain tapping against the window. Then I said quietly, "I'm not asking you to fight the world, Hayes. Just don't let it scare you out of something real." He looked at me for a long time, so long I thought he might walk away. But instead, he reached out, brushed a strand of hair from my forehead, and whispered, "You're too young to understand how much the world can take from you." I caught his hand before he could pull away. "Maybe, but I'm old enough to know what I want." Days turned into weeks. We became careful shadows of ourselves, passing smiles hidden behind fences, brief touches in the dark, words carried through silence. Sometimes he'd leave notes in my mailbox. Simple ones. You looked beautiful in the morning light. Meet me by the lake after sunset. I can't stop thinking about your laugh. It was dangerous and intoxicating, like living inside one of my poems. At the lake, we'd sit by the dock, letting the cold wind bite our cheeks while our fingers found each other in the dark. He'd tell me about the years before the dreams he'd buried, the person he used to be, and I'd tell him about the poems I never showed anyone, the parts of me that felt too fragile for daylight. Sometimes, when he smiled, it felt like forgiveness. But there were moments when fear crept in like cracks in the ice beneath us. One evening, as we walked back from the lake, headlights flared behind us. Car slowed down. I recognized the driver, Mr. Donovan, from down the street, the kind of man who believed gossip was a civic duty. He looked at us, suspicion sharp in his eyes. Hayes tensed beside me. His hand slipped from mine. After that, he started pulling away. Calls went unanswered. Doors stayed closed. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I crossed the yard and knocked on his door until he opened it. He looked pale, exhausted. Eli, it's late. So what? I snapped. You've been avoiding me for days. Just tell me what's going on. He rubbed his face. I got a call from the school board today. I blinked. The school board? He nodded. Someone reported seeing us together. They think I'm involved with a student. My stomach dropped. But you're not a teacher anymore. I was, he said quietly. And people don't care about the truth. They care about the story. I wanted to scream, to tell him it wasn't fair. But the fear in his eyes silenced me. So what now? I whispered. He looked away. Now, I think you should stay away from me. At least until this dies down. My throat tightened. You're ending it? I'm protecting you, he said. Even if it means breaking both our hearts. I shook my head. You don't get to decide that for me. But he was already turning away. Go home, Eli. And just like that, the door closed. For days, I didn't see him. The house next door looked empty, hollow. I tried writing, but every poem felt like a funeral. My world shrank to the space between my walls. Then one morning, I found another note in my mailbox. Meet me at the lake. Sunset. Please. H. I went, even though I told myself I shouldn't. When I arrived, he was already there, standing by the water, his reflection trembling in the ripples. He looked like a man torn between two lives, the one he'd built from silence, and the one he'd found in me. I'm leaving town, he said quietly. The words hit me like a stone to the chest. What? I need to, just for a while, until things calm down. I swallowed hard. And what about us? He looked at me, eyes wet. You deserve a life that isn't built on hiding. I don't care about hiding, I said, stepping closer. I care about you. His voice broke. Don't make this harder, Eli. Then don't make it goodbye. He exhaled, a trembling breath. If we stay, it'll destroy you. I shook my head, tears spilling over. No, it's not love that destroys us. Hayes, it's fear. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The lake shimmered with the dying light, and in that fragile stillness, he reached for me slowly, like he was afraid the world would see. Our foreheads touched, and I felt his tears mix with mine. I'll come back, he whispered. When it's safe. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to freeze time right there. But the wind blew colder, and the truth settled in my chest like a stone. Nothing stays safe forever. He left 2 days later. No note this time. No goodbye. Just silence and an empty house. I tried to move on. I threw myself into work, into meaningless routines, into pretending I didn't glance at his porch every morning. But grief isn't loud, it's quiet, creeping, patient. And sometimes, it shows up in the strangest ways. One evening, months later, I was walking home when I saw a stray cat sitting on my porch, a small white one, with a note tied to its collar. She used to sit by the lake. Thought she might like a new home. My breath caught. I looked up at the horizon, where the sun melted into the trees. For the first time in weeks, I smiled. He was out there somewhere, still quiet, still careful, but maybe still thinking of me. I picked up the cat and whispered, "He'll come back." Time softened everything. Spring arrived, painting the town in color again. The gossip faded. New stories replaced old ones. But sometimes, when I wrote late into the night, I could still feel him in my words. One evening, I sat by the window, watching the light fade, when I heard a car pull into the driveway next door. My heart stumbled. I stood, every nerve alive. Through the glass, I saw him, older somehow, a little thinner, but still him. He's carrying a single suitcase. He looked up, and for a heartbeat, our eyes met through the window. He smiled, soft, tired, true, and I knew he'd kept his promise. That night he came over. The air was thick with everything we hadn't said. I opened the door, and before I could speak, he said, "I read your new poems." My chest tightened. "You did?" He nodded. "They're beautiful. You're beautiful." And then he stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "I missed you." This time I didn't hesitate. I reached for him, pulling him in. The kiss tasted like homecoming, like forgiveness, like the start of something that no longer needed hiding. But happiness, I'd learned, isn't a destination. It's a choice. Every day, we still kept our distance from the world, still careful, still quiet but no longer afraid. The neighbors could think what they wanted. The world could twist our story however it pleased. Because the truth was simple, we'd found something worth surviving for. And for the first time, I didn't need poetry to make sense of love. I was living it. It's been a year since he came back. A year since the sound of his footsteps returned to that quiet street. Since laughter started to echo between our two houses again. And yet, sometimes, when I wake up before dawn and look out at the garden, I still half expect the house next door to be dark, empty, haunted by silence. But it isn't. Now there's music playing softly through his open windows. The smell of coffee drifts in the air. And sometimes, I see him in the yard, sleeves rolled up, sunlight tangled in his hair. He looks freer somehow, like the world finally stopped demanding apologies from him for simply existing. We've learned to live gently, to love quietly, to let time rebuild what fear once tore down. Still, the past doesn't vanish. It lingers in small, unspoken ways, like how he sometimes wakes in the middle of the night, heart pounding, eyes unfocused. I'll reach for him, whisper his name, and he'll breathe again. Or how, when we walk through town together, he keeps a small distance, old habits dying hard. But every once in a while, his hand will find mine, quick and sure, as if to remind himself that he doesn't have to hide anymore. It was late summer when he asked me to move in with him. He didn't say it like a grand declaration. He just looked up from the breakfast table one morning and said, "You already live here most of the time. Might as well stop pretending you don't." I laughed, nearly spilling my coffee. "That's your romantic proposal?" He smirked. "What do you want me to say? That I can't breathe unless I know you're in the next room?" "Yes," I said, smiling. "Exactly that." He reached across the table and took my hand. "Then yes, I can't breathe unless I know you're here." I moved in the next week. We didn't make a big deal of it, no celebrations, no announcements. Just two people choosing a home, quietly, without asking permission. The first night, as I unpacked my books, he picked up the old poetry journal, the one that started everything. Its pages were worn, soft from time. He ran his thumb along the edge and said, "This little thing caused quite a storm." I took it from him, smiling. And somehow, it brought us to peace. He looked at me for a long moment before whispering, "Eli, I don't ever want to be your storm again." "You're not," I said. "You're the calm after." We built a life in fragments. Small moments that stitched themselves into something whole. Breakfasts shared on the porch, our legs brushing beneath the table. Long drives with no destination, windows down, music loud. Afternoons in the garden, where he'd pretend to teach me how to plant tomatoes but end up kissing dirt off my hands. Sometimes we fought about nothing and everything. About his tendency to retreat into silence when he felt overwhelmed. About my stubbornness when I tried to fix what wasn't broken. but the fights never lasted long. He'd always find me after, quiet but soft-eyed, and say, "You still want me here?" And I'd answer, "Always. But love doesn't mean the world stops testing you." One Sunday, we went to the farmer's market. We were walking hand in hand when we heard a voice behind us. "Hayes!" He froze. I turned to see a man in his 40s, clean-cut, wearing a teacher's badge. Recognition flickered in his eyes. "Hayes? This is Mark. From Lincoln High." Hayes' smile faltered. "Mark. Wow, it's been years." The man's gaze shifted between Ushy's hand and mine, the easy way we stood together. His smile thinned. "So, this is what you've been up to." Something cold slid through the air. Hayes straightened, his tone calm but steady. "This is Eli, my partner." The word hung there clear, defiant, unashamed. Mark blinked, taken aback. "You're right. Well, good for you, Hayes." His voice was too sharp to be sincere. "You always were full of surprises." He walked away. I looked up at Hayes, expecting to see panic, but instead I saw something else. Peace. Later, when we got home, he laughed softly. "I didn't think I'd ever say it out loud like that." "What? That I'm your partner?" "Yeah." He smiled. "Felt good, though." I leaned against him. "Told you the world wouldn't end." He kissed the top of my head. "Maybe it did. And maybe this is what came after." Autumn came again, the season that started everything. I was working on a new collection of poems, my first book. Hayes helped me edit it, sitting beside me late at night with reading glasses slipping down his nose. "You know," he said once, halfway through a draft, "I never thought I'd be in a poem." I laughed. "You were always in them. You just didn't know it yet." He smiled, brushing my cheek. "Then promise me something." "What?" "When people read these, promise you won't hide. Don't pretend you wrote them about someone else." I hesitated. "You know what people will say." "Let them," he said simply. "We've lived in their shadows long enough." The book came out that winter. The Quiet Between Houses. It wasn't a bestseller, but it found people, the lonely ones, the dreamers, those who'd ever loved someone they weren't supposed to. I received letters from across the country. From boys afraid to come out, from men who thought it was too late, from women who saw themselves in our kind of silence. One message stood out. "Your words made me feel less ashamed of loving who I love." "Thank you." I showed it to Hayes. He smiled and said, "You see, the world needed your truth." I kissed him then, right there in our kitchen as snow began to fall outside. Months passed. Life became ordinary again, but in the best way. We adopted another stray cat, painted the living room a soft blue. He started teaching part-time at the community center, helping kids find their own voices through writing. I kept writing too, but now the words were lighter, less about longing, more about living. Sometimes at night, we'd sit by the fireplace with our cats curled at our feet, and I'd think about how impossible all this once felt. How love had started as a whisper and grown into something that no longer needed hiding. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the world turned golden, he said, "Do you remember the first time I found your journal?" I laughed. "You mean when you accidentally read all my embarrassing confessions?" He grinned. "They weren't embarrassing. They were honest." He reached into a drawer and pulled out that same old notebook. "I kept it," he said. "All this time." I blinked. "I thought I lost it." He shook his head. "No. I kept it because it reminded me of the first time someone saw me who I was supposed to be, but who I actually was." I felt my throat tighten. "Hayes." He opened the journal and handed it to me. Inside, tucked between the pages, was a folded piece of paper. I opened it and froze. It was a new poem, but written in his handwriting. "For Eli, you taught me that love isn't something we earn, it's something we allow. You made silence feel like a home. You made me brave enough to live again." I looked up at him, tears blurring my vision. "You wrote this." He smiled softly. "You're not the only poet in this house." That night, we danced in the living room. No music, no audience, just us and the rhythm of breathing. His hand rested on my waist, mine on his shoulder. Outside, the rain began to fall, tapping softly against the glass. He whispered, "Do you ever think about how impossible this should have been?" I nodded. "Every day. And yet we're here," I finished. He smiled, his forehead against mine. "Maybe that's what love is. Surviving the impossible." Years later, people would ask me how our story began. I'd always say the same thing. It started with a notebook, and a man who decided to read what wasn't meant for him but somehow needed to. They'd laugh, thinking it was romantic or funny, but it was more than that. It was the story of how truth found its way through fear, of how two people broken in different ways learned that love doesn't need permission. The last poem in my next book was dedicated to him. It read, "Love is not a rebellion. It's a return to the place where we were always meant to belong." On our porch now, years later, we still sit together as the sun sets over the same quiet street where it all began. The neighbors don't whisper anymore. The world has changed in small ways and big ones. He leans back, eyes closed, the evening light painting his face gold. "Do you ever regret it?" he asks. I shake my head. "Never." He smiles. "Good. Because if I'd known reading your journal would lead to all this, I would have done it sooner." I laugh, nudging him. "Liar." "Maybe," he says, pulling me close, "but I'd still do it again." And as the sun dips below the trees, I realize that the story that began with secrecy ends not with fireworks, but with peace, with two souls who stopped apologizing for loving each other. Because in the end, the forbidden became sacred. The silence became music. And what started as a secret became the truest thing we ever knew. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.